look around the spot where you're sitting right this very moment. Now, imagine being in that spot 67 years in the past or the future. Would it look different? Well, take my house, for example. It's only 32 years old, so 67 years ago, the spot I'm sitting in would be bushland. But what about 67 years into the future? Will the building that you're in still exist? Will my basement be exactly the same, but slightly more holographic? It's hard to imagine, huh? Well, that's because it's really hard to predict the future. But we've actually always been very bad at it. Don't believe me? Well, let me show you something really cool I found in the archives. So they won't actually let me into the ABC archives to film, so this liminal space full of filing cabinets we bought on Marketplace is just going to have to do.
Hello there, you in the future.
Hello. This is Reverend Frank Borland talking to us from 1959.
Are my thought waves reaching you?
Yes?
You know when the ABC rang up and said, "Would you like to write a letter to the unborn?" I immediately said, "Why not? I'm going to try anything once."
67 years ago, Reverend Borland was invited to participate in an extraordinary project conducted by the ABC in Adelaide to write letters to the future.
What kind of a fool thing was this I'd been asked to do? A letter to the unborn? To a nobody, in fact. A non-existent person.
Bit rude. But of course, to the Reverend, I am a nobody. I was born 17 years after his death. But thanks to this project, the Letters to the Unborn, that's not an issue. In fact, we can hear from all sorts of really interesting people.
Well, hello to you. This is being written in 1959.
Hello there, hello. Hello. Can you hear me?
Dear unborn one,
Dear future one.
We must be almost literally an open book to you as it is. We are the most self-exposed generation that ever was up to this time. We've photographed ourselves so thoroughly that you may, if you're interested, see what even our insides look like.
These letters are beautiful and strange and touching and occasionally quite racist. And also, almost all of them make predictions about the future.
Letter writing will be as outmoded as speech. And the word speech, I feel I should explain, because it may mean little to you.
We are still across the concept of speech here in the 21st century, Max.
This letter isn't supposed to be read until 2100 AD.
So yes, we might have dug a few of these up early.
So if you stumble upon a copy or dig it up earlier, read it by all means, I can't stop you. But then put it back.
But the extraordinary thing about the letters is that even the ones addressed to us right now in the first half of the 21st century get all of their predictions wrong.
Global peace and international harmony will be completely attained by the year 2000. The price of this great and ultimate good has been the faculty of criticism in every individual.
Perhaps you just press a button or twiddle a knob on some time machine and pop into any point in time and space.
But you all commute daily and hourly so fast through space in your private flying saucers.
Reading these letters kind of got us obsessed with this idea of predicting the future and how predictions that can seem so obvious to everyone at the time can be so totally off. Why? Well, it turns out that knowing more about an issue can actually make you worse at predicting what's going to happen next. Let me give you an example. Here's a box. If I said to you, there's a swan in this box. What colour is the swan? You, an Australian in 2026, will probably hesitate. You've seen swans of multiple colours. But if I'd presented this box to a man in London in, say, 1650, he would have said with 100% certainty that the swan inside was white. Saying that something was like a black swan was a common way of saying that it was impossible, like saying something is as rare as hen's teeth or like getting blood from a stone. That's because until Europeans landed in Australia and saw the Australian black swan for the first time, they had no idea a swan could be anything other than white. They were missing key information, just like our friends from 1959. But what was the information they were missing? Over the next 4 episodes, we, you, me, and this weird virtual void, here in 2026, are going to go through the letters sent to us from 1959 and investigate why they were so wrong. We'll look at where those black swans that they couldn't see coming came from and what we can do to avoid being bitten by them ourselves.
Sorry to keep you waiting, complicated business.
I'm Matt Bevan, and from If You're Listening, this is our special series, Black Swans. We're going to start with something our letter writers were obsessed with, something that we are still trying to predict these days: population.
Now, even if official attitudes were to change quickly, I, for one, expect the population problem to be with us for many generations.
The letter writers were convinced that the Earth was destined for horrific overcrowding.
The people who make a study of these things tell us that in the foreseeable future, there'll be standing room only on our Earth.
So why did they think that? Well, it's not hard to see when you look at a chart of global population. And bear with me, we're going back a little bit further than 1959, right back to 10,000 BCE. So this is the world population over the last 12,000 years since the agricultural revolution. And you can see that basically nothing happens until the last 300 years, and then it kind of goes crazy. Just 1 second. We're going to need to zoom in here. Right, so it passed 1 billion just after 1800. It passed 2 billion in the 1920s, and as the letters to the unborn were being written in 1959, it passed 3 billion. It would have felt like the population was increasing exponentially. And it was such a concern at the time that the ABC produced a documentary about it in 1965.
The world's population now stands at about 3,300 million people. It is expanding at the rate of about 65 million each year. In 1980, the estimated figure is 4,300 million, and in the year 2000, 7,000 million people, and so on in geometrical progression.
You can understand why people believe this was all heading towards inevitable disaster.
Statisticians warned that the population of the world was growing so fast that it would be jam-packed full in November 2026 AD. Doomsday, 60 years from now.
Hang on, that is this year. Okay, anyway, at the time, an impending doomsday wasn't the only thing waiting on the horizon. There was also the fear that a rapidly increasing population meant that they would run out of food. That's because at the time, the most horrific famine of the 20th century was underway in China.
In this age, 2/3 of the people of the world are half-starved. In the places where this is worse, like India or China, the population leaps forward so fast that it is impossible to improve the situation.
Meanwhile, experts were warning that worse was to come.
By 1980, I looked for the entire continents of Asia, Africa, and Latin America to be engulfed in virtually a total famine.
3 whole continents in total famine by 1980. It sounds like a serious crisis, and a serious crisis needs a prominent spokesperson. This one had a really good one.
Paul Ehrlich has become the best-known advocate of immediate population control.
Paul was a media dream. He was young, he had sideburns, he was always ready with a snappy retort.
He would seem to cut right across inalienable human rights.
Now you say these are inalienable rights. As a favorite sport of people is to make up inalienable rights to fit their own preconceptions.
In his 1968 book, The Population Bomb, Ehrlich wrote that the battle to feed all of humanity is over. In the 1970s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now. So doomsday was coming not in 2026, but much sooner.
It could happen tomorrow. That's how thin things are. In other words, a serious change in the world's weather or an even sharper drop in world fisheries last year than this year, and we could be in very serious trouble immediately. But I would say, if I had to put my money somewhere, I would bet somewhere around 1980 now, but that could change in either direction.
He thought people needed to be restricted by law from having large families, a prospect that many people thought was appalling. At the time, it had never been attempted anywhere in the world.
The best answer from the point of view of democracy seems to be an across-the-board limitation of family size to 2 children unless the second birth is a multiple birth.
If governments couldn't stomach this kind of restriction, then Dr. Ehrlich prescribed a propaganda campaign.
The first thing that has to be tried is a governmental program of propaganda. The president simply announcing that it's stupid and irresponsible to have more than 2 children.
The brutal reality is that man is using up his environment.
The president at the time was more hesitant to call people stupid than the current occupant of the Oval Office. So what else have you got?
He ought to make the FCC see to it that large families are always treated in a negative light on television wherever they appear.
Sorry, Brady Bunch, you're the villains now. The population bomb was wildly popular, selling millions of copies. But why? Well, demographer Bernard Salt has a theory.
I wonder whether, in fact, it struck a chord with people fearing the future, having concern for what lay ahead, and what seemed to be a logical narrative. There seemed to be evidence for it. I can understand people making that projection.
Now, it's worth noting that Ehrlich wasn't the only person making pronouncements and predictions like this. In 1972, a group of academics, politicians, civil servants and industrialists called the Club of Rome published a series of computer simulations they'd devised to predict the future.
The program shows that Earth cannot sustain present population and industrial growth for much more than a few decades.
They set doomsday a little later than Ehrlich did.
Round about the year 2040, 2050, civilized life as we know it on this planet will cease to exist.
The club's book, Limits to Growth, which includes a blurb by Ehrlich and cites his work in multiple places, was an even bigger hit than the population bomb and was translated into dozens of different languages, including Chinese. The American government didn't follow Ehrlich and the Club of Rome's advice on population control, but the Chinese government sure did. At the time, the Chinese population was hurtling towards 1 billion, and the government felt that the best way to avoid future famines and to increase their standard of living was to have fewer kids around. They started with propaganda campaigns, encouraging people to get married later and to only have 2 children. And in 1979, they implemented the one-child policy.
The state keeps records of the breeding potential and performance of all residents. Who's been sterilised? Who's taking the pill? Who's signed the promise to have no more children?
They were aiming for Ehrlich's dream, 0 population growth. But while China, South Korea and other countries were implementing their Ehrlich-inspired population control policies, the Australian government was actually looking to increase population growth. They even appointed a minister to head up a national population inquiry in the early 70s, a sharpshooter called Al Grasby. In Al's opinion, trying to control Australia's population was pointless and wrong.
You'd have to appoint a police force that would have special lots that would enter all the bedrooms of the nation and say, that's enough. That's the first thing you'd have to do. And secondly, you would have to put a kangaroo curtain around the nation and say, no one else will enter. Now, that would be wrong, immoral and impracticable in both cases.
And a big reason for this attitude was that Australia's domestic birth rate had started to decline.
I think it will go up and down, but I think the long-term trend will be downwards.
It was doing this even without any population control policies or propaganda. The interesting thing experts were noticing was that given the choice, many people were deciding entirely of their own accord to have fewer children.
If you want to have a bit of your own private life, perhaps continue a career that you started, it's impossible with all the money in the world to bring up 8 or 10 children.
So perhaps Ehrlich's population bomb wasn't quite as explosive as he thought. Oh, and the enormous famines he predicted, they weren't happening either. In fact, despite his prediction of hundreds of millions of people starving to death in the 1970s, The decade saw fewer deaths from famines than any of the previous 6 decades. But Ehrlich wasn't fazed. He just revised that chapter of his book. Now the first line read, "In the 1970s and 1980s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death." But the 1980s saw deaths from famine drop even further. In fact, 3 times more people died from famine in the 1960s than in all the decades since, combined. So what's going on here? Where are all the famines? Why does it now seem unlikely that the planet will be
jam-packed full in November 2026 AD?
Well, at this point, I think it's worth pointing out a very important fact about Paul Ehrlich. The Population Bomb was actually his 4th book. His first 3 books were How to Know the Butterflies, Butterflies and Plants, and Process of Evolution, which was in large part a book about butterflies. Ehrlich is a lepidopterist, a butterfly scientist. It was his wife, Anne, who researched population. She had, in fact, co-written the book. But the publisher said that it would sell more with just one author, so goodbye, Anne. But even Anne's expertise was as a biologist, and she studied animal populations, not human populations. The book is full of comparisons to the behaviour of animals, rats, rabbits, that kind of thing. Animals that breed and consume resources all the way up until they overtax their environment and have a massive population crash. Here in Australia, we see it frequently with kangaroos. Variations in rainfall lead to massive variations in the kangaroo population. Booming in the wet years, and then in drought, it's like Armageddon. The argument set out in the Population Bomb is that this is what would happen with humans, but on a longer timescale. Resources would become scarce and all hell would break loose.
The eventual consequence is that sometime between now and the turn of the century, we're going to have a huge die-off from either a massive famine or a nuclear war or vast plagues or a combination of all 3.
So what happened? Why didn't we have a human roopocalypse? Well, here's the ABC's chart again, which was basically in line with what experts like Paul Ehrlich predicted, although it's wrong. So here's what they expected, and here's what actually happened. And if you ask a modern demographer what's going to happen next, it's going to sound very different to Paul Ehrlich.
There is a concept now known as peak humanity. We expect the maximum number of human beings on the planet to be reached in about 2080, so it's about 60 years into the future. And thereafter, the projections by demographers are that the number of people on the planet will slowly start to subside.
What about feeding all those people, though? I think it'd be best to grasp all of this data by putting it on the same chart and looking at how things have changed since the publication of the Population Bomb in 1968. So here's how the world population has grown since then. And you can see that food production has actually tracked ahead of that. But that's because we've been converting the wilderness into farmland, right? Well, no. Here's the growth in agricultural land. It's basically flat. So we're making way more food using the same amount of land. How? Well, remember that black swan in a box that no one could predict? Here's our very first one.
Born in Cresco, Iowa in 1914, Norman Borlaug pursued his commitment early to fight against hunger. For the last quarter century, he has been engaged in more than one skirmish for the Green Revolution. Since the age of 30, Dr. Borlaug has been in Mexico.
I've been here for 26 years, working in wheat all of this time.
When Norman Borlaug started his agricultural work in Mexico, he couldn't afford a mule or horse, so he pulled the plough himself. By 1965, he was leading a multinational crew of wheat scientists, all working to breed new types of wheat. Borlaug and his team developed a type of wheat that was far more resistant to bad weather, could grow in lots of different conditions, and could produce more food than the traditional type. And this wheat formed the basis of what became known as the Green Revolution, as more and more strains of cereals were developed.
In the last decade, these new crops have achieved remarkable results in several parts of the world.
often doubling and even tripling previous yields.
The Green Revolution has now been credited with saving 1 billion people from starvation and won Borlaug the Nobel Peace Prize. With these new, more robust seeds, crop yields, that is the amount of food you can get from a set amount of land, skyrocketed. That's how we can produce more food from the same amount of land. Of course, it also relies on a lot of pesticides and fertiliser, which many people are opposed to, but Norman Borlaug says that's just the price we have to pay.
The world must decide that either we use agricultural chemicals and use them wisely, the right amounts, the right kinds, to produce the food we need, or we will all starve.
That seems reasonable, but according to Ehrlich, even if it all works perfectly, it won't be enough.
If we're very fortunate, the Green Revolution will buy us 10 to 20 to 30 perhaps years to solve the population explosion. If you know anything about demography, you know that short of a rise in the death rate, there is no way whatever you can possibly bring the population explosion to a halt in that time.
Are we like kangaroos, rats and rabbits? Will our population expand until we reach the limit of the planet's resources? One of our letter writers, just one, expressed some doubt.
Is the only limit to population that of starving thousands following a limit in food supply? Experiments with animals, such as mice, birds and tiny weevils, have shown that population increase may cease, notwithstanding the presence of ample food supply.
In fact, some demographers saw this happening in human populations well before Ehrlich or our letter writers put pen to paper. In 1945, the American demographer Kingsley Davis wrote that people who attempt to calculate the theoretical maximum population of the planet by looking at food production were being unrealistic because it is impossible to guess what technological improvements will be made during the next few centuries. As he was writing that, Norman Borlaug was pulling a plough by himself somewhere in Mexico. But the possibility of technological advances wasn't the point of Davis's piece. It was about what he called the demographic transition, the way that as a society's quality of life increased, the fertility rate decreased. It was already obvious in the data. There was a clear fertility decline in all the richest countries in the first half of the 20th century. Davis drew a direct link between high literacy and low fertility. He predicted that as societies like China and India industrialised, their population would stabilise and then begin to fall. He wrote, "A rapid growth of the world's population need hold no terrors. It seems likely that the next century will see the peak of the world's population growth reached."
It's a very interesting view that Kingsley Davis has put forward, and especially in 1945, quite prophetic when you think about it.
For the first time in this episode, we've found someone who was absolutely bang on in his prediction. But Kingsley Davis wrote that in 1945. And by the end of that year, things had changed somewhat.
Stampeding to the nearest phone box, reporters spread the news to a waiting world. From the east coast to the west, Americans' millions had only been waiting the official word to go completely wild.
Of course, 1945 triggered the effective start of the baby boom, pretty much 9 months after the demobilisation of the troops had started.
Davis seems to have lost all faith in his own predictions and became a very strong proponent of population control policies.
I wonder what happened to Kingsley Davis if he lost heart with the coming of the baby boom.
He's quoted in Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb as saying that just offering contraceptives to parents is not an effective form of population control because it leaves individuals in charge of population growth. And yet Bernard Salt thinks that educating people and providing them with contraceptive pills worked better than anyone expected.
At the time that Paul Ehrlich published The Population Bomb, the pill, of course, had been invented and had been distributed, but it hadn't really had a significant impact by the late 1960s. 10, 20, 30, 40 years later, of course, it has profoundly changed the future of humanity.
In 1967, just over 2 decades after his first entirely accurate prediction, Kingsley Davis wrote something that I find extraordinary. He said that if a government wanted, they could control population by following these steps. Squeeze consumers through taxation and inflation. Make housing very scarce by limiting construction. Force wives and mothers to work outside the home to offset the inadequacy of male wages, yet provide few childcare facilities. Encourage migration to the city by paying low wages in the country and providing few rural jobs. Increase congestion in cities by starving the transit system. Increase personal insecurity by encouraging conditions that produce unemployment. Yeah, let that sink in. Now, he said that he didn't think that governments would do this because it was obviously immoral and evil, but I reckon he was probably onto something there. It seems like a few governments did it by accident. That paper was written the year before the population bomb, and it seems to have had very little impact. In fact, as far as I can see, Kingsley Davis has spent most of the last 6 decades buried in obscurity. Perhaps if he'd grown some groovy sideburns, things would have been different. In the 1950s and 1960s, when our letter writers and butterfly experts were fretting about catastrophic famines and high birth rates, they were assuming that those things would just keep happening. It's a perfect example of recency bias. We assume that the things that are happening now will keep happening. Trends will not change direction. If things are getting worse, they'll keep getting worse. And if they're getting better, they will keep getting better. They were missing 2 black swans. One was that wealthy, literate societies stop having so many babies. The other one was that human ingenuity can find ways to eke enormous amounts of food out of every hectare of farmland. Today, those black swans are having extraordinary ramifications. China, South Korea, and most countries that pursued aggressive population control policies back in the 70s and 80s are now facing a demographic crisis.
It's an entire generation in China that has been reduced. The problem is when you extend that across a generation or 2, then you're not just reducing the current population generation, but you're reducing the next generation of people who will produce the next generation.
The people born before those policies are retiring, and they didn't have enough children to replace themselves in the workforce. And the children that were born don't want large families, so the workforce a few decades from now will be even smaller. The demographic transition that Kingsley Davis was talking about happened in China, but it was totally masked by the one-child policy.
And in actual fact, if you look at government policy, the policies are more likely these days to encourage people to have children.
Just 45 years after they were worried about having too many babies, China now faces the prospect of having too few. Oops. The thing is, our letters are full of things like this. Predictions that seem so obvious at the time and turned out to be so wrong. And the reasons they were wrong are fascinating. And they say a lot about the assumptions that we're making now about what the future holds for us. So I hope you'll join me over the next few episodes as we look into 3 key questions that were a big deal then and remain a big deal now, but for entirely different reasons. Where are we going to live? How are we going to get around? And are we all going to die in some kind of apocalypse? But I can promise it's not all doom and gloom. I can say that with certainty because, spoiler, I know where this journey ends because I wrote the script. And I can confirm that by the end of it, I kind of feel uplifted, optimistic. Given the state of the world right now, I know that's unexpected, but I think you'll probably feel like that too. I'll catch you in the next episode. Maybe. I can't predict the future.